So, welcome everyone. I think everyone who's with us tonight has heard this opening spiel, but thank you all for participating, because I really do think that bringing this group together to read this book, to discuss the themes in it, and to process what our response can be to the moment that our nation is in has been really important. And at the end of our time today, I'm hoping that we can talk about what next steps might look like, what options we have for a coordinated response, or for individual next steps. Let's begin with a prayer. Breath of God, breath of life, breath of deepest yearning, come, Holy Spirit. Comforter, disturber, interpreter, inspirer, come, Holy Spirit. Heavenly friend, lamp lighter, revealer of truth, midwife of change, come, Holy Spirit. God is here. God's Spirit is with us. This is just a review of the pledge that we have made about how we conduct ourselves in this discussion, that we will act in good faith and give one another the benefit of the doubt. We will speak truth and seek truth, which means releasing defensiveness or the need to win an argument. We will respect each other and ourselves. And we will take responsibility for the quality of the discussion, gently reminding each other if we feel like that reminder is warranted, and also committing to adhere to these practices, even if others do not. We have the raised hand emojis, and people also have been physically raising their hand to participate in discussion. A reminder that you can put resources in the chat box to share, and those will be sent out this Friday. And you can also use the chat to communicate with specific people if you didn't understand something that someone said and you need clarification, or if you just want to, thank somebody for a contribution they made. There's the option to private chat, and feel free to step away from your computer to take care of yourself and your body at any time. Here we are on the last week of our gathering, and the theme that we're looking at tonight is white supremacy. So as we have done in previous weeks, we will have 30 minutes at the beginning where I'll present that theme and some history and some sort of frameworks for understanding that concept. And then we will spend 60 minutes in smaller breakout groups to discuss in more depth some of the questions that we sent out in last Friday's email. And then we'll return together for the last 30 minutes to wrap things up. And as I mentioned earlier, tonight we will try to spend a chunk of that time talking about possible next steps. Caroline and I have a couple of ideas, but we also want to hear from other folks' ideas and desires and hopes that we might have about how we can respond to this new understanding of what's happening in the church in America and in our national politics. So to get started, I wanted to just do a little bit of an overview of some of the patterns of racism that Kristin DuMez points out in the book. Some of the places where we see racism threaded into the habits and the worldview of the white evangelical church. So one of the first place is the recurring theme of militant white heroes, these men who are protectors, who use violence or the threat of violence in order to maintain order and keep communities or individuals safe. These heroes are often defined by non-white outsiders that are perceived as the threats. So we see that, you know, right in the first chapter with Teddy Roosevelt and the frontier and the Spanish-American War and some of the imperial movements that were a part of that presidency. We see it in John Wayne's movies and the attacking Native Americans and the white settlers and the heroic cowboys that are able to defend the community. We see it also in these last chapters that we'll be looking at tonight. We see it in the American response to 9/11 and the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, that sort of Islamophobia becoming a really prominent form of racism, coinciding then with Barack Obama's presidency. And so that dynamic of the white hero being defined by a non-white outsider threat is a theme that we see recurring. And then that combined with the reality that non-white men cannot take that same militant stance in a public way without there being pushback. So a Black man comes with a gun to protect a community and is at risk of the police coming and killing them. There's this limit to who can occupy that role of the militant hero. One of the other patterns that we see throughout the history that DuMez lays out is a discomfort with desegregation. This was one of the pieces of racism that was new to me, to understand that desegregation and discomfort with desegregated public schools and public restrooms directly connected into the Equal Rights Amendment resistance, that then the same families that were uncomfortable with the desegregation of public schools then bought into this lie that the Equal Rights Amendment was going to force white girls to be in the same restrooms, that there were going to be all gender neutral restrooms, and these white girls were going to be in the same restrooms as Black boys. And that the way that racism was threaded into that resistance of feminism was new information to me in reading this book. So it was that period in the 70s and the 80s, in the wake of the desegregation movement and the resistance to the Equal Rights Amendment, that you see the emergence of homeschooling as the norm in many evangelical communities, and an uptick in private Christian schools that were the alternative and could skirt some of the regulation that public schools were expected to adhere to. So yeah, the fear about the impact of the Equal Rights Amendment was directly connected to that. And I don't think it's a stretch to see the current fears about including trans children in our church schools and protecting them as directly connected to that thread. There's a thread about bathrooms being safe or unsafe spaces, and that fear being used to define a threatening other or outsider. That's a part of current rhetoric. And we also see it in all of the conversations now at public school board meetings where parents are saying, we have a right to know what the curriculum is and everything our child's going to be taught in the classroom for the whole year. We have the right to have a say in what books are in their classrooms or in the public library, to eliminate the books that make us feel uncomfortable. You know, that parents' rights and school choice language has been a part of this evangelical white Christian culture for a long time, and it's connected directly to desegregation and discomfort with the civil rights movement and that part of American history. And then the final pattern that I wanted to name is a recurring pattern related to the fear of cultural displacement. So one of the places we see this in the book is in the story about the Promise Keepers movement, and how in the early stages of that movement, there was a strong commitment to racial equity, to bringing Black speakers, to really working on racial reconciliation in their gatherings, to the extent that one year that was the primary theme for the whole national conference. But the year that the theme was racial reconciliation, the majority of the negative feedback they got after the conference had to do with racial reconciliation being the theme. And it was not long after that one of the founding leaders stepped away, and that the Promise Keepers movement shifted away from that commitment to racial equity toward a much more militant expression of white masculinity. So the fears of cultural displacement have led to evangelical churches ignoring or dismissing invitations to racial equity and racial reconciliation. And they've also led to reactionary conservative politics. And one of the places where we see that really starkly at present is that there is an increasing number of voters and elected officials who subscribe to something called white replacement theory, which is the idea that there is actually a intentional conspiracy to displace white Americans as the majority, and to like inhibit white fertility rates and shift resources into communities of color and open the borders to immigrants, specifically so that white people are no longer a racial minority or majority in the country, and other people have control. And one of the really specific beliefs that's part of this conspiracy theory is that Jewish leaders are the masterminds behind it. So there's anti-Semitism married to xenophobia and racism that is a present part of politics today. There's a really lovely snippet of a sermon that a rabbi gave just this past weekend that talks specifically about this theory and its impact and why her community should be paying attention to it. And I'll be including a link to that video in the email I send out on Friday so that you can watch it as well. I think that knowing how to recognize when particularly someone who's running for an elected office subscribes to this idea is really important for us, so that we can recognize the situations where we need to really push to vote and to encourage other people to vote in those races. So now I want to step back and talk about some of the concepts that are connected to understanding the way that racism functions in North America. If you look at the bottom of this chart, the smallest circle, the little blue circle, is individual racism. And this is sort of the default that a lot of Americans go to when they think of racism as a concept, that racism is an attitude that individuals hold and it impacts their individual actions. And within that category, it's important to recognize that there's both overt racism, but also covert racism. So we see things in the news about overt acts of individual racism. Somebody using a slur, somebody targeting someone for harassment or abuse specifically because of their race. But covert acts of individual racism are ones that are sort of beneath the surface. Those can be things like a teacher giving more time and attention to their white students than to their Black students, or recommending their white students for advanced placement classes and not recommending their Black students for those same opportunities. And sometimes those covert acts of racism are intentional, but most of the time they are unconscious. That's one of a lot of the research that's been done in the last half a century has confirmed that almost everyone in North America walks around with some unconscious racial bias that impacts the way that we interact with people of different races than our own. And a really classic study about this that you might have seen was a study where African-American children were given two dolls, a white skin doll and a black skin doll, and asked to pick which one they would prefer to play with. And very consistently, these young Black children under the age of 10, would pick the white skinned doll to play with because, and when they were asked why, they said because it's prettier, because it looks nice, because it's a good kid. They had all of this internalized value attached to the color of the skin of these dolls, and it was value that devalued their own existence and identity. So that's those kinds of covert kinds of racism are one part of what we try to raise our own awareness about in the process of doing anti-racism work. Another classic example of covert racism is the impulse that many white people have to lock their car doors when someone who is Black passes by on the sidewalk. It's something that's not conscious, but when you recognize that it's a pattern, you begin to realize the impulse is there, and that there's this unconscious perception of threat that has to do with the color of someone's skin. Let's move then to the second circle, the yellow one. And this is a concept called systemic racism. Most of the anti-racism work that's being done with organizations, churches, schools, business companies, is focusing on systemic racism. And systemic racism operates in our society regardless of the individual attitudes or decisions of anyone in decision-making positions. So a classic example of this is the history of redlining, which was the practice that started during FDR's presidency, where certain neighborhoods were ranked so that banks would be able to determine which neighborhoods were considered secure investments and which ones were not. And very consistently across the whole country, in every urban area, Black neighborhoods were designated as red neighborhoods that were not safe investments. And so it became almost impossible for people to get loans in order to purchase property in those neighborhoods. That has dramatically impacted the ability for Black families to gain wealth that they can then pass along to subsequent generations. And it's something that still affects the property values in many neighborhoods in urban areas, including in Kalamazoo. The property values on the north side are different than the property values in West Nedge Hills. And West Nedge Hills had on their property deeds, the original titles to those properties, there were clauses prohibiting the sale of those homes to Black families. Even today, because of that history, if someone goes into a bank in town trying to get a loan for purchasing property on the north side, it will be harder to get that loan than it would be to get a loan somewhere else in town, regardless of the personal beliefs of the person they're interacting with at the bank. The person they're interacting with may be very intentionally pushing against individual racism in their personal life, but because of the policies that have been set up by the bank and the way that property is valued, it's still a barrier. So that system, the way that system functions because of the history, is a really classic example of the way that systemic racism is still a part of our communities, regardless of the individual attitudes of the decision-making people in those systems. Last, I'd like us to pull back to the orange circle, white supremacy, which is kind of the background worldview that shapes both individual racism and systemic racism. White supremacy is the conscious or unconscious assumption that whiteness is more valuable than other racial or ethnic identities. We are distressingly confronted with far more overt and conscious expressions of this in public life in our country than we have experienced for a long time. There are a lot of people who have a national stage who are expressing white supremacist beliefs as personal beliefs that they consciously hold. But white supremacy is also something that is baked into our culture in ways that impact all of us, whether or not we're conscious of it and whether or not we choose it. One piece of this is that for many of us who are white, we have lost connection to our cultures of origin. There's been a trend throughout American history of people immigrating from different parts of Europe, being considered outsiders and being treated unfairly and unjustly because of that. It happened to Italian immigrants, to German immigrants, to Irish immigrants, to Scottish immigrants. You know, there were wave after wave of people who met hostility because of their country of origin, but then over generations were able to get absorbed into dominant white culture, largely by letting go of their language, letting go of their food cultures, letting go of their cultural identity, their distinctive cultural practices, in favor of conforming to a dominant white culture. So that culture of white supremacy, what defines a culture of white supremacy is what I want to look at for a moment here. There is a sociologist, Tima Okun, who has put together these characteristics of white supremacy culture. Not all of these characteristics are present in every organization or every system that, you know, that is white, but these are characteristics that frequently make it difficult for people within an organization or a community to build equitable relationships with people of color. And some of these might be surprising to you. I know that when I first encountered these descriptions, I was surprised that perfectionism was one of them. I never thought of perfectionism as being a particularly white idea, but the way that perfectionism functions creates a barrier for many white people in moving toward racial equity because there's a fear of not doing it right. And if we don't do it just right, then we've done it wrong. And we can't do things wrong because there's shame associated with that. Another one, fear of conflict, functions in a really similar way. We don't want to confront racist attitudes or patterns in relationships that we have at work or in our families because we know it will generate conflict, and conflict is something we have been enculturated, we've been trained to avoid. Tima Okun, who developed these ideas, has an extensive and beautiful website that I will share a link to on Friday so that you can explore these ideas a little bit more. And she has much more detail about how she defines each of these characteristics and how they function in communities to uphold power differentials between white people and people of color. And so to conclude this opening presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we can do with feelings of guilt. I was tempted to also talk about feelings of shame because those are a big part of evangelical culture, and those of us who grew up in evangelical culture can quickly default to shame. But that's such a big idea and such difficult work that I would rather have those conversations one-on-one. So if shame is something that you are working on in your life and you want to talk about it with someone else who's also doing the work, feel free to reach out to me and we can set up an opportunity to have those conversations at another time. But it's normal and it's natural for us to feel guilt when we're confronted with the realization that we've participated in harm. And when we are learning about white supremacy and racism in our culture, that is something that we are inevitably confronted with. It's also something that some of us have been confronted with in reading this book all through, in the ways that we've participated in patriarchal structures, in toxic masculinity, in political movements that have taken rights away from all kinds of people in our society. So what do we do when we feel that guilt? One of the temptations is to bypass it, to distract ourselves from the feeling of guilt by either doing something that makes us feel a little better about ourselves, makes us feel like we actually are a good person, or that just separates us from the feeling long enough that we can kind of move forward. You know, so just distract with television or comedy, something that we can laugh about and get into a different space where that feeling is no longer in the foreground. But those practices are part of repression which isn't healthy for us. And the feeling of guilt doesn't disappear. It stays in our body, it stays in our brain, stays in our heart. And we need to process, we need to look at the guilt in order to move through it into a space of healing. So one of the steps of processing guilt is to observe it with as much of a non-judgmental lens as we can. So not saying, oh, I'm such a bad person, but to say, I feel guilty about this part of my past. And that it is understandable that I feel guilty. And it doesn't feel good to feel guilty. You know, to name those realities as realities that aren't about being a good person or being a bad person, but just the reality of what we are experiencing in that moment. From observing that, we can begin to consider opportunities to make amends. The 12-step programs have fantastic resources on processes of confronting guilt, naming harm that you've done in the lives of other individuals, and working to make amends for that past. So if you are not already familiar with the 12 steps, it's worth picking up one of the 12-step books. The classic one is the Alcoholics Anonymous book, but there are many different 12-step books that go through those steps, and steps 4 and 5 are the ones that deal with doing an inventory of the harm that you've caused and then going through the process of making amends. So I just recommend that as a resource as we think about concrete action that we can take as we process guilt. Both of these steps are towards the last two are sort of the aims. The goal is not to avoid or bypass the feeling of guilt, but instead to allow that guilt to be a turning point of transformation in our lives. So we want the goal of our lives to be transformation into a new way of functioning in the world, not alleviation of the discomfort of the way that we have been functioning in the world. And some of that is genuinely celebrating the ways that we are no longer in a space that we've been in the past, the ways that we have already transformed and matured and had our eyes opened to realities. So I also, again, have a couple of websites that have recommendations for processes that can be used to sit with and then move through guilt. And I will include those links in Friday's email. So now it is 7:30 and I will stop screen sharing so that we can move into our breakout rooms.